Hi everyone and welcome to AXA Coral Live. We've got a fantastic lesson for you today. It's all about the future of, or should I say the futures of coral. What are the possible futures for this amazing underwater ecosystem spaces? And we have Dr. Valerie Chamberlain, who will be joining us all the way from Curacao. But this is just to say, this is the third of a sort of three lesson sequence. So on Tuesday, we heard all about the coral ecosystem from Dr. Michel Aclates. Yesterday, Dr. Mark Vermey took us through the relationship between humans and the coral ecosystem, looking at both the benefits of coral to humans and also some of the impacts that human activity has on the reef. And both those lessons are available to watch on catch up, either on the encounteredu.com website via the live lesson section or on the Encounter Edu YouTube channel. So do make use of those if you haven't seen those already. Wonderfully, we've got some shout outs to give to some of those classes who are watching, and it's a big hello to students at King Edward VI College, and a big welcome also to those watching from Felsted School in Essex. Wonderful to have you all with us. So this is this futures lesson. We'll be looking at two things, one of which is some of the predictions for the future of the coral ecosystem, and then secondly, looking at some of the strategies that can be put in place to choose a sort of more preferable future for coral. These graphs aren't set in stone, and we have, like much environmental work and issues at the moment, we have decisions to make going into the future. Before we welcome Valerie, just a couple of things on the live chat. Please do put any questions that you have for us onto the live chat on YouTube. That's a box to the side of the video screen. If you are viewing full screen, you'll need a secondary device. And in terms of questions, if there's questions of clarification, do pop those in during the talk. Otherwise, we'll come to those wider, broader questions at the end as part of a Q&A section. There is also a white speech bubble on the encounteredu.com website. And if you pop your question in there, both those methods come through to Sim, who's moderating today's session, and then that will pop up for me to respond to. But without further ado, let's see if we can connect through to Valerie. Valerie, how are you?
Hi, Jamie. I'm doing great, thank you. Hi, everyone. It's really an honor for me to be here today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. You are joining us from the Kamabi Research Station in Curacao, which has been our sort of home from home over past coral lives. But just briefly describe your surroundings and what makes it such a great place to work on the reef.
Yeah, absolutely. The Kamabi Research Station is located directly, by the seaside. So we have the luxury of, having an ocean front. So I can give you a little bit of an idea behind me. What you see now, the door is open, but you can see our scuba diving facilities. So there's people getting ready to get in the water soon. And on the other side, this is what I was talking about. So we have really the ocean front here. And this is where we do a lot of diving for research, just from the station.
Absolutely fantastic to have those science and scuba diving facilities so close to where a lot of the researchers are living, and then to have the natural world, your focus of study, just a few minutes swim from where you stay. I mean, brilliant place to do coral research. Valerie, we're talking about the future of coral, and I've found some graphs online to have a look at. And just for those watching, all these graphs and all the notes are on a slideshow you can download from the lesson page. But the first diagram I found, it's from the IUCN. It's talking about the number of at-risk coral species. Describe what we're seeing here. I mean, it looks fairly drastic.
Yes, Jamie. So very sadly, during the last decades, coral reefs have been declining, which means a lot of foundational species, the coral species, have also been declining. Many of them are actually critically endangered. We're afraid some of them are going to become extinct. So the general, portrait of the health of coral reefs is declining. It's pretty sad. But it's not necessarily the case for every single coral reef, in the world. And I think that's part of what we're going to be discussing a little bit throughout this lecture today.
Because I also saw that, we hear and we see in the news about the Great Barrier Reef with these mass bleaching events, this effect of warm water. And if you look at a graph of the coral coverage on the central Great Barrier Reef over the past decades, it's not a sort of like a sort of linear sort of decline. It goes up and down. What's happening there, and does that give us hope?
Yeah, so what's been happening on the Great Barrier Reef is that very often, when you see those declines, they are caused by global warming. So when the sea surface temperature becomes too hot, corals go through events that we call coral bleaching, and then a lot of them do not survive. However, some of them do go through the bleaching event, do survive, and if there's not a multitude of other stressors that are acting all at the same time, then those corals might have a chance to recover and rebound. And that's what we see on those graphs, where there are peaks of decline and then peaks of increase in coral abundance again. And that's very hopeful.
And so, Valerie, we've looked at this picture. It's not all doom and gloom. We see sort of possibility of recovery. But you mentioned this important concept, which I think is great to cover up front, and that's this idea of multiple stressors. And it's something that we covered a little bit with Mark yesterday. But could you just give us an idea of some of the stresses that coral ecosystems face?
Yes, absolutely. So there are different categories of stressors. Some of them are more global issues, and some of them are more local issues. The global problems are, for example, global warming, which we know is going to cause increasing sea surface temperatures and also ocean acidification. Those are occurring around the globe. And then there are more local stressors that are, for example, pollution directly from shore, overfishing on specific areas of reefs or different islands. And those are very much local stressors.
And I think we haven't shown already. We've got a summary diagram that's in the human and coral reef sort of slideshow from yesterday's talk as well. But you talk about all these different stresses. Does that mean that we don't just have a single way of conserving or, for want of a better word, saving the reef?
That is a very, very important aspect, of preserving coral reefs. There's more than one issue, so there's not, one solution that fixes it all. And it's also that different reefs are exposed to different stressors, and different organisms that live on the reef are more or less susceptible to some of those different stressors. So when we do conservation work, we really have to look into, what is happening, what are the problems, how can we fix them, and generally it's more than one issue at a time. So unfortunately, like I said, there's not just one recipe to fix it all.
And I think the students watching may be familiar with the global effort needed to combat carbon emissions and some of the strategies involved in decarbonizing society and the economy. What are some of the sort of more local stressors that you see on the island where you are, or on other sort of reef systems? And what are some of the sort of strategies that you can work on to deal with those?
Yeah, that's very important. Like when we talk about global issues, it might seem sometimes a bit more overwhelming, because those problems are at the scale of the entire planet. But there are things that are easier to address for nations directly, in our environment. And those examples are, for example, I mentioned overfishing. Overfishing can be addressed by implementing no fishing areas or fish quotas. We also have coastal development, not overdevelop some stretches of coast that are directly in front of coral reefs, or at least do it in a smarter way. So there's a lot of things that we can address directly, locally, that are maybe a bit easier to fix than global warming in general.
Amazing. It'd be great to sort of unpick a couple of those and work through sort of how those stresses affect reef health, and then what some sort of very concrete examples of solutions look like. You mentioned, first of all, overfishing. And I know that talking to some of the people who've been at Kamabi or in the area for a long time, that there used to be, hundreds of sharks, just in the bay, just near you. Probably not a problem for you going and doing your research at the moment. How does the population of fish affect the health of the reef?
That is very important, Jamie. Fish populations, what is important to understand is that different fish species have different roles or functions on the reef. I think one of the easiest examples to understand is that there are fish that are herbivores, and those are grazing the reef. And basically, their role is to remove all of the algae and the turf that is growing. They're kind of like lawnmowers, and they keep the reef clean. And so if we start overfishing these specific species, then this can result in overgrowth of algae. And those algae it's important to know that they are detrimental when they're too abundant. They actually can start growing over corals. They host a lot of different bacteria and, gnarly chemicals that are really, really nocive to corals. So when we lose those fish species, then those algae cannot be controlled. Like no one is there to keep them in check. So that's one example of how overfishing can, for example, harm coral reefs.
And so you're talking about sort of herbivores. I mean, would those be species like sort of snapper and parrotfish, sort of, and those end up on people's dinner plates?
Yeah, parrotfish is one good example. When we talk about snappers, then those are the fish that are typically food for bigger organisms, like for example sharks. If those are overfished, then we don't have the food for the bigger organisms on the reef. So everything is really in a balance, and if you miss one link in the food web, then someone is going to be hungry or someone is going to multiply very fast. So there's the balance goes out of control, out of spin.
And they great for students watching. If you thought that studying food webs was just something you had to do to tick a box or to do something, is actually vital in understanding how to conserve the reef. And so in overfishing terms, I mean, do you just ban fishing and we move to a vegetarian diet? I mean, what's the solution?
It's definitely important when we are as consumers to pick the species that we're going to eat a bit more in a smart way. There are fish species that are really declining that we should avoid eating. Not all fish species is the case. So it's not necessarily that we should completely avoid eating fish. It's just choosing the species in a bit of a smarter way.
And then I mean, you just allow fishing for those certain species, or is it important to remove fishing altogether, or from certain areas?
Removing fishing altogether would be very difficult. A lot of nations around the world, millions of people rely on fisheries to eat and for their income. Removing fisheries completely is going to lead to another big problem, which could be poverty and hunger. So we don't want that. One of the ways to control fisheries better is, for example, to implement no-take areas or like marine protected areas where fisheries are not allowed, or to implement fishing quotas. It can also be that for certain species, we only allow fishing a certain size of fish because the bigger ones might be females that are more fecund and that help the populations reproduce. So there's a lot of strategies that we can use that are not entirely, removing fisheries, but again, fishing in a smarter and more respectful way for nature.
Amazing, and great to cover that with wonderful concrete examples. You also mentioned coastal development, and I know certainly just sort of in front of where you are, there's a big development from sort of, I think, probably the 70s. How, and students may have seen big hotels or housing developments on the coast. What impact do those have on coral reefs, and then what can we do to mitigate that?
Yeah, so the development of really large hotels directly on the coastline involves many different things. One of them is the physical damage. When you start building on shore, then it automatically results in a lot of sedimentation, and you're moving, the ground, and a lot of that ends up in the ocean. Really often those hotels will also want to include a beautiful break wall with an artificial beach, and that needs to be built pretty much on top of the reef. And then a third aspect is also the fact that they often have, beautiful grass that is fertilized and rich with nutrients, and that also ends up overflowing in the ocean. So all of this major coastal development, when it is not done sustainably or not smartly, can very much impact coral reefs.
And how then do we stop this? The dirt sort of almost like smothering the reef by sort of making the water too cloudy, or the fertilizers getting onto the reef. How do we stop this from happening in the future?
We can opt for, smarter options. One of them, when we talk about grass, why would we grow grass in the tropics where it's really hot? It doesn't necessarily grow as well. We need fertilizers. Why don't we just use native plants? There's a lot of alternatives out there, and they're not necessarily what we are used to see in a tropical resort. But if we get used to it and actually appreciate more of the native nature, that would also work. Then more and more people that are traveling, tourists, they are researching more a kind of tourism that is more exploration or adventure. They don't necessarily want to just lay on a beach with a cocktail all day, but they rather go, explore nature. And those types of tourists are more and more common, and they actually prefer staying in smaller places that feel more homey, that are more representative of the local culture. So that's great. We really see a shift of tourism from mass tourism in big hotels to a bit more exploration type or ecotourism, nature tourism. So that's really great.
So fantastic to hear that sort of, development, planning laws, zoning, that kind of thing, that local and the national governments can start to put these policies in place that don't, I imagine they protect the terrestrial environment as well as the marine environment, that these larger developments, you're saying how they can cause destruction and damage to the reef. One of the things I've picked up from that is maybe a wider piece around water quality, and you've sort of touched on it a little bit. Can reefs survive in any type of water, or are they a little bit fussy? I think it's the first thing.
There are always exceptions, Jamie. You can always find a coral that for some reason managed to grow in really poor quality water. But in general, corals will thrive in water that's cleaner. If the water is very murky, if there's a lot of sediments, the sunlight doesn't come through as much, really. And then, they rely on sunlight for photosynthesis. So that's very important for them. Water quality that is not optimal really often includes a lot of microbes and viruses. So microorganisms that can give diseases to corals. So poor water quality is definitely an issue. And that often comes from problematic sewage treatment facilities. We have that sometimes on Curacao. That is something that we are working hard to resolve so that we keep our waters cleaner.
And I suppose, I mean, it's pretty easy to see that, you know, corals are animals just like us, and if our environment were flooded with effluent, for want of a better word, human health would decline, and it's exactly the same
It's the
for the
same,
coral.
yeah.
And we've got, and I think we've got a diagram that shows we've got these sort of global efforts. You know, the Paris Accord. You know, in the UK, they've announced that no new diesel or petrol cars from 2030. There are various initiatives. I imagine a big debate about how effective they'll be, but moving towards this sort of zero or low carbon world. And then we have those local efforts that sort of help the coral a bit more. You work on something sort of tangential or that fits alongside those two strategies. What are you working on at the moment?
I work on coral restoration. So coral restoration is it's a technique or it's a tool, you know, in a toolbox of different strategies we can use to help the recovery of coral reefs. And the idea with coral restoration is to multiply the number of corals that are on the reef. So we propagate corals and then we try to help repopulate coral reefs that are declining.
And that sounds very simple. It sounds a bit like sort of gardening almost. But I imagine that you're not dealing with a plant, you're dealing with an animal, and it has all sorts of idiosyncrasies. Is it a bit more complicated than it sounds?
Yes, it is. Working with corals is, you know, it's a vast field. Coral restoration includes a lot of different techniques. There's not only one technique to propagate corals. So my specific job, my work, is to do research on coral restoration to optimize it, because there are still a lot of, you know, a lot of unknowns, and there's also a lot of areas where we know we could still do some improvements to make restoration more effective, so that we can better help the reefs.
And Valerie, I've seen video. I don't know whether it's of you or by you of a what's known as a mass spawning event. And
Yes.
so I know that you've been incredibly busy. That often happening in the month of October, and you just sort of like coming back to life, as it were, sort of after those hectic days. Why are you in the water and interested in coral spawning as part of restoring a reef?
That's a great question. So my work is really focused on one kind or one type of restoration. To do restoration, we use baby corals, or, you know, coral offspring, and those babies are produced once or twice a year by corals in the middle of the night during those events that we call coral spawning. And so the idea is that by using a lot of different babies, we study them, and eventually they are placed back to the reef. And every single of those babies is brand new. They include new genetic information. They're, you know, they're unique individuals, and we think that by outplanting or transplanting, you know, thousands of those brand new corals on the reef, we can make a difference for future generations of corals on the reef. So my work involves, you know, we first have to go collect the eggs, you know, of those corals to make the babies. And I think we have a nice video that shows the event of coral spawning. And it's really a fantastic event. You know, during 1 or 2 nights of the year, all the corals of one species, they synchronize themselves and they release their eggs all at the same time in the water column. And so, like I said, it's in the middle of the night, so we are there with our dive lights, and it's really beautiful, beautiful scene. Those eggs start floating up in the surface, and then it really resembles an underwater storm, like a snowstorm. And then what we do from there is that we use special nets, and then we collect those eggs, we bring them in the lab, and then we fertilize. We have them fertilized, and then we grow those baby corals to better study them and eventually replant them to the reef.
Valerie, I mean, it sounds like an amazing and fascinating work. Why can't you just let nature take its course? Why are you know, scientists like yourself getting involved?
So we've talked earlier that coral reefs are not doing really well in general, and the result of that is that in very often cases, corals from a same species they're less abundant, which means that you cannot find, they're more distant because there's less of them. It's really hard for a male and a female coral to meet each other. And also, really often, those corals are not as healthy. They produce less eggs. So they have really a difficult time to find each other in the water column and for fertilization to happen. So what we do is that we really give them a chance by collecting all of those eggs from separate parents, and then we bring them together in the lab where we mix them all in one bowl. So, we take the whole ocean, we make fertilization happen in a small bowl to make sure that all of those parents have the chance to meet each other and fertilization to happen.
And so I've got this sort of this first stage, and then when we see video of the reef, a nice healthy reef, and everything else, is there a stage in between your mini ocean in a bowl in the lab and those coral babies being a sort of a flourishing, healthy coral colony?
Yes, so there's multiple steps. Like I said, we collect the eggs. We have to ensure that those eggs were fertilized, and then they start their life by being small embryos. They're very sensitive. We make sure we don't use any bug spray, any sunscreen, because those are really nocive to baby corals. It can actually kill those embryos really fast. So during those days, we give them a lot of care, and then eventually, when the young corals are ready, we provide them with what we call starter homes or tiles. They're like artificial tiles on which those babies can attach and start growing. And I have one example of those starter tiles here. They're a bit of an odd shape.
Amazing. And just, there's a whole. I've got so many questions about Valerie on that, and just getting into the detail of the scientific process that goes behind doing that. So obviously, there's a reason why you need a starter home in the first place. How did you come up or realize that?
So it's important to know that at the beginning of their life, coral babies are actually swimming. They are searching for a place where to attach. And we call those coral larvae. And those larvae, they're super small, but they're kind of smart. So they're really picky. They really want to find a place where they have the best chances of surviving in the future. Because once they have attached to those to the reef, they're going to be stuck forever. So those starter homes that we give them have to be exactly what they want. And that can range from different structures, rugosity, it can be the overall shape. But most importantly, it's really important what also grows on those tiles. I mentioned earlier how algae can be really bad for corals. Well, right now on the reef, in many places, there's really a lot of algae overgrowth because we have, like I said, water quality problems and overfishing happening. So on those starter homes, we give a little bit more space, for those coral offspring to grow. They have the entire tile to kind of claim, hopefully, before those bad algae come in.
And how many different shapes did you go through before you came up with that shape?
We're still working on different shapes. That's one area of research. Actually, we spend a lot of time working on this. The idea behind those is there's multiple features. So first of all, there is the material from which the starter home or the tile is made. This is now ceramic. We used to make them out of concrete. And cement or concrete is really porous, and algae actually really like that. So that was not a good choice. So we are investigating different types of materials that the coral larvae like, but that the algae don't like. There's also, you can see in this, if you look really well, you see those little grooves, the little indents inside of the tile. And those we call them microhabitats, small habitats, where those coral larvae or coral babies can be really sheltered. So when they sit in those little cracks, they have really their backs kind of nudged against the tile, and they're a bit more protected from the algae that are, coming in, and also sometimes predators that want to eat them.
And is the color important at all?
The color can be important. Corals can actually, because of different light properties of light, they can actually sense different colors. So some species prefer red, others prefer black. It varies between species.
And I mean, it must be. I mean, and you set that up in this sort of, you have aquaria, you set it up, and you sort of put different colors and see what the preferences are, and all that sort of, that kind of research.
Yeah. So really, each single feature of those different starter homes or tiles have been studied in depth. We tested a lot of different materials. We tested a lot of different small shapes for microhabitats. We are testing different colors. Also, you can see how this one has, those 4 legs. We like those because they're really easy to just simply wedge in the reef. We don't need to use any plastics to secure them or nails or anything. So those are great, but we didn't start with those necessarily. So it's really like a long progression towards the ideal or the perfect starter home.
And it's amazing. We've got some wonderful questions coming through, but before we get to those, just to summarize again, can you say that any one of these sort of 3 groups of strategies, sort of global reduction of carbon emissions, reducing local stresses, and coral restoration, are more important than others, or do you have to have it all?
No, absolutely. They need to be applied in synergy. I think one of the best examples is if corals on a specific coral reef are dying, then adding more corals to that same reef is not going to fix the problem if the actual stress has not been alleviated from that reef. So if the corals are dying because of bad water quality and you don't fix your water quality and you add corals, well, those are also not going to survive. So coral restoration especially really has to be applied in conjunction with management and conservation regulations.
I think there's a really, I think great question, and one that you probably sort of grapple with a bit. There's a question through saying that we often hear about the giant panda and other what are termed charismatic megafauna going extinct, but not so much about sort of corals, although there is a little bit more news on the bleaching. Do corals deserve more publicity?
Absolutely. I think one of the iconic species, especially for the Caribbean, that's really in trouble. And, there's more than one, but that's the one that I think most of us in the Caribbean know about, is the elkhorn coral. In the early 80s, and there was a disease that spread around the whole Caribbean, and that killed over 95% of that species throughout the entire Caribbean basin. So that species is now critically endangered, and we don't hear as much about it, than the pandas, for example. So I think it's important that those species also, they also deserve attention.
Just on that, what would you like all students watching to go out and do in terms of coral and maybe elkhorn publicity?
Can you repeat, Jimmy? I didn't hear that well.
What would you like students watching to do in terms of boosting coral and perhaps in particular elkhorn corals, publicity?
I think it's important to talk about it. Protecting nature is only going to happen if people care, and even more if you have some emotions attached to it. When you think that a coral reef is beautiful, it's not necessarily super objective, but it helps getting the message across. And then there's all of the really more objective things to think about. Like, for example, the elkhorn coral is very beautiful, but it's not the only reason why we should protect it. The elkhorn coral they look like big underwater trees. I think we have images of this species that we can show. But they are really, really big underwater trees. they with their branches, they make three-dimensional structure that is really a good habitat for a lot of fish and invertebrates like octopuses, crabs. So a lot of fish and other species depend on those elkhorn corals to survive. And then the elkhorn is, so big and has really strong branches, and they grow really, really shallow. And when there are storms that are incoming, big waves that come to the coast, the elkhorn is actually going to break down those big waves and dissipate the wave energy. So, on top of being pretty, those elkhorn are protecting our coasts from storms. So our houses, they are providing us with fisheries, and they are a place of biodiversity. So that's a promotion I would make for the elkhorn coral. Not just that they're beautiful, but they are actually useful for us as well.
There you go. To everyone watching, go and share the message about the wonderful elkhorn coral. Absolutely fantastic. Thank you, Valerie. There's a question that you've touched on it before in terms of mitigation techniques, but is there a single biggest factor that is damaging coral health at the moment? If you could sort of pick one.
I don't think necessarily there is one single factor. Different reefs are impacted differently by different factors. The Great Barrier Reef right now is definitely most impacted by global warming. They don't have as much other problems like overfishing or poor water quality. So the single factor that is the most important for them is there's flies. I'm sorry, that would definitely be global warming. But there are some coral reefs here that are not always being struck by global warming, where it's more impacted by a disease, for example. So there's really different parts of the world, and even different reefs locally have their own challenges. I think it's too simple to say there's one problem that would solve it all again.
Thank you. The interesting question here. I'm talking about artificial reefs, and I imagine this sits alongside the restoration of existing reefs. And the question is, can artificial coral reefs replace dying reefs? And are there any negatives around using artificial reefs?
There are, I think, artificial reefs. There's a lot of different kinds. Yeah. In some cases, people will say, I want to make an artificial reef by sinking an old car or sinking car tires. And, this is basically adding pollution to the reef and then you pretend you're going to make an artificial reef. There's, however, much smarter ways to make artificial reefs, which could be, for example, just at least making a more stable substrate on the reef itself, creating three-dimensional structure with materials that are more similar to what is already on the reef, like, for example, corals are making skeletons, and that is then what we call limestone. And limestone can be used as a material to do artificial reefs instead of using old car wrecks. So it really depends how it's implemented.
And can they, are there examples of them effectively replacing reefs that have died off?
I don't know of one concrete example that really has successfully replaced entirely a reef. I think replacing a reef will be very difficult because, once again, it needs to be achieved with a lot of different techniques at the same time. So you would have to have artificial reef in an area where you also have all the protection from your fisheries and coastal management, etc. But those different solutions can help. They might not entirely replace, or they might not bring back the reefs that were there in the past, but they're at least, a step forward.
Thank you. One lovely question, but one tough question just to put you on the spot. And you can. The question is: do you think governments around the world are doing enough to save the reefs? And maybe say, what more could governments around the world be doing?
Well, the answer is no. They're not doing enough. I think that's also very depending on where you are. Some locations are doing much better than others in terms of government policies and decisions. I'm really proud of Curacao, actually. I came here about 10 years ago, and since I'm here, there's a lot of new regulations in place to help the islands. We have designated 5 different conservation areas on the islands that include different wetlands, including coral reefs. We are talking now about no fishing areas. So there's a lot of work that's in progress really fast, like within a 10-year time frame. And that's really dependent on different countries. Some countries are, moving faster and responding faster to coral reef decline than others.
And what more, if you could single out a few things, what more could governments do to save coral reefs? What are some of the important priorities you see?
I think for the governments in general, it would be really necessary to, first of all, some countries don't even recognize the problem. Be honest about what is happening to the reefs, and it's then really about taking the decisions to implement local. For governments, you're talking about local decisions to maybe change the way we do tourism, change the way we do fisheries once again, and then for the larger groups that are thinking all along together, well, then it's definitely addressing the global warming issue.
There's a really nice question here, which is we've seen some great video and some photos of being underwater, the sort of almost the glamour of being a coral scientist. You've also mentioned lab work, and I imagine that there's probably some large amount of computer work as well. What kind of, in terms of the job, how much time do you spend in the water, in the lab, and sort of at a desk behind a computer?
It varies a lot, especially in my case. We have really busy seasons where my team and we are diving a lot, and that's during the coral reproduction or coral spawning events. So at the end of the summer, fall, we do a lot of scuba diving. We spend a lot of time on reefs, and that's followed by a lot of lab work, which eventually this all becomes data or numbers, because we look at their survival, their growth, and then we spend a lot of time behind the computer. So in my case, it's more by phases. There's months where I'm almost every day underwater, and months where I'm only at my computer.
And just for those watching, it's absolutely fascinating. Everything from material science to reproduction to ecosystems to huge amounts, and even looking at the social science as well of how you then manage that scientific data in the case of something like overfishing into community policies. What would you do to say to somebody who said, okay, this is fascinating, I want to get involved? What advice would you give to someone sort of like school age sort of level about what they can do next?
Well, I think the first step is to really talk about it, share what they learned today with their families or friends, parents. Like I said, information and passion is the first step to get closer to helping coral reefs. And then, it's making smarter decisions about what you consume, for example, different fish species, reducing plastic use. All of those steps are, they're all little steps forwards to help coral reefs.
So they can choose to do a science degree, do their masters, try and get an internship.
They can also do that, definitely. If you really want to get involved, as a career in the future, then definitely you should take a path in sciences, do a lot of biology classes, and then eventually you would go to university and really start specializing on coral reefs.
And you work for an organization, Sea Corps International. Do they offer internships?
Yes, absolutely. We have every year we have multiple students from all over the world. Right now we have one. I have one field assistant that is from South Africa, and then his colleague is from France. I am Canadian. My colleague is from the Netherlands. So people from all over the world come to Curacao to do internships. And at Sea Corps, we offer internships quite often. So once you are at a university level, then definitely you are welcome to apply to do internships here.
I imagine quite competitive. I imagine the yes, it is. Valerie, thank you so much for being part of Coral Live again. And sorry we didn't come out in person this year. It's always great to collaborate with you. And thank you so much to all the students watching this lesson and to those who've been watching previous lessons. Very sadly, this is the final live lesson of AXA Coral Live this year. We're hoping that we can be out at Carmarby bringing you more important information and stories from the world of coral science to deepen your understanding of this wonderful yet fragile ecosystem, and one that Valerie showed that the future is not set in stone, and that we all have a role to play in a better future for coral. So Valerie, thank you so much again. And
it was a pleasure.
And it's goodbye from Coral Live. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you everyone.
Thank you.